We have uncovered so many important structures that prove this temple functioned as a temple during the time of Queen Cleopatra and the Greek pharaohs. So this could be the perfect place for Cleopatra's lost tomb.
After 2,000 years, scientists finally reveal the real cause of Cleopatra's death, and it changes everything. For generations, the story seemed fixed in stone. The last queen of Egypt, cornered by Rome and stripped of power, pressed a venomous snake to her skin and embraced a swift, symbolic death. The image is so familiar that it almost feels like a memory. Cleopatra in silks, a coiled asp, a marble floor in the fading light of an Alexandrian afternoon. Yet the new research does something astonishing. It does not just adjust the details of that scene, it redraws it entirely. The familiar snake slithers out of the story, and in its place appears something far more deliberate, far more learned, and far more unsettling. A carefully engineered act of pharmacology that reveals Cleopatra not as a victim of circumstance, but as a strategist who turned her own body into a final political statement. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. The chain of revelations began not with a dramatic tomb opening, but with fragments and traces, the kind that usually slip through the cracks of popular imagination. Archaeologists and historians had long suspected that the legend of the snake was more literary than literal. Accounts written decades after Cleopatra's death disagreed on basic details, like where the serpent appeared, how many people died alongside her, and even which snake species could have been involved. None of them matched what modern toxicology knows about venom and how it acts. The new research team treated these contradictions not as nuisances, but as clues. Instead of hunting for a snake, they asked a different question. What kind of death would make sense for a woman who had been educated in Greek philosophy, who ruled a land steeped in Egyptian temple medicine, and who understood the political power of spectacle better than most rulers in history? The turning point came when a cache of medical and ritual papyri, unearthed years ago near Alexandria and long misfiled as generic temple texts, was re-examined with fresh eyes. Among discussions of ointments, perfumes, and narcotic mixtures, the team identified a sequence describing a highly controlled poison regimen, designed for a person of high status who wished to die with minimal disfigurement and predictable timing. The recipe blended extracts from several plants known to ancient physicians, a powerful cardiac toxin, a sedative that dulled fear and pain, and a compound that slowed the heartbeat enough to make the transition almost imperceptible. On its own, this might have been just another example of ancient pharmacology, but the text was accompanied by marginal notes, added later in a different hand, that referenced a royal woman in Alexandria and a moment of political upheaval. Suddenly, the abstract formula began to look like a script for Cleopatra's final act. Laboratory analysis supplied the second half of the revelation. Relics long associated with Cleopatra's final days, small cosmetic containers, traces of unguents on the interior of a metal box, crystalline residues on jewelry believed to have belonged to women in her entourage, were subjected to cutting-edge chemical scrutiny. Techniques capable of detecting infinitesimal traces of organic compounds revealed a cocktail of substances closely matching the formula on the papyri. Even after 2 millennia, fingerprints of plant alkaloids survived, bound to metal and stone. They did not resemble venom from a snake. They resembled medicine, or rather the dark twin of medicine, a precision dose of death prepared with the same care a physician might use to craft a cure. When researchers reconstructed the likely sequence of Cleopatra's final hours using this pharmacopoeia, the old image of a chaotic, fearful suicide started to crumble. The poison mixture described in the texts acted over a predictable window of time. It would begin with a gradual lightness in the limbs, a slowing of breath, a drifting of the mind, just as consciousness began to loosen. The face and body would remain largely unmarked. There would be no swelling, no blackened bite marks, no grotesque contortions. It was a death designed to preserve dignity and even beauty, a serene tableau suitable for a queen whose life had been lived in the public gaze. It suggested planning, rehearsal, and collaboration between Cleopatra and the learned physicians of her court. In this reconstruction, she is not stumbling upon a snake in desperation. She is following a protocol, one likely prepared days in advance, with measured doses and carefully chosen attendants who shared her fate. This new picture forces a reckoning with the way earlier writers framed Cleopatra herself. Classical sources, written by men from the victorious Roman side, like to portray her as a creature of emotion and seduction, ruled by passions, enslaving great men with perfume and luxury. The snake fit that story perfectly. It was exotic, theatrical, and tied neatly into Roman prejudices about the East. A queen who relied on a precise pharmacological plan, on the other hand, suggests something very different. A woman who understood chemistry, dosage, and timing, who had access to a sophisticated medical network, and who trusted science and calculation more than myth in the most important decision of her life. The new evidence exposes how deeply those Roman narratives have shaped modern imagination, and how much has been edited out to accommodate a more convenient stereotype. The implications for the history of science are profound. The papyri and chemical residues show that Hellenistic Alexandria was not just a city of abstract mathematicians and philosophers, but also a center of advanced practical toxicology. The recipe attributed to Cleopatra's circle was not the crude poison of popular tales, a simple draft of hemlock or opium. It was a carefully layered combination of substances designed to work together, one amplifying or counterbalancing the other. That kind of knowledge does not appear overnight. It points to generations of experimentation, observation, and record-keeping by Egyptian, Greek, and perhaps Near Eastern healers whose names are lost to us. Cleopatra's final decision to rely on that expertise makes her, in a sense, a patron of applied science, even at the threshold of death. This in turn changes the way scholars think about the relationship between politics and medicine in the ancient world. Royal courts were not simply places where doctors treated fevers and wounds. They were research hubs where pharmacological knowledge could be tested and refined, especially when it came to poisons. The queen's body, in this case, became a site of both political and medical experimentation. The choice of a plant-based poison over a snake was not only symbolic, it allowed for precise scheduling. Cleopatra would have known that Roman officers were closing in, that messengers might be watching, that rumors would spread the instant she stopped breathing. A controlled poison let her pick the exact moment when the story of her death would begin, when she passed from active ruler to enduring legend. This makes the event itself not merely an exit, but a choreographed performance with scientific timing, designed to escape Roman arrest while denying Rome the spectacle of a public execution. The revelation also casts new light on the way stories are built and transmitted. If Cleopatra died by a controlled herbal poison, how did the snake become so dominant in later accounts? The answer probably lies in the power of metaphor and propaganda. A serpent could be lifted easily into the language of moralizing Roman historians, who loved to contrast their own supposed simplicity and discipline with Oriental luxury and danger. A snake could slither into poetry, relief sculpture, and stage performance. It turned a complex medical decision into a moral fable. The new findings show how effectively that fable overshadowed the messier truth. They invite readers and viewers to look again at beloved paintings, plays, and films, and to imagine the invisible vials and physicians standing just off stage, erased by centuries of repetition. Seen through this new lens, Cleopatra emerges not only as a political strategist, but as a curator of her own legacy. Choosing a pharmacological death rather than waiting for Roman judgment allowed her to keep control over the single most important message any ruler can send, the manner of their leaving. As queen of a land where gods were reborn and royal deaths were woven into cosmic cycles, she would have understood the symbolic charge of that choice. A clinically timed poison undermined Rome's power to parade her as a trophy. It also ensured that her last image, however distorted by later storytellers, would be one of self-directed action. The scientific discovery, therefore, does not simply modify a detail about how she died. It recasts her entire final chapter as a case study in agency, even under the heel of an empire poised to swallow her kingdom. There are ethical questions as well. and they reverberate beyond Cleopatra's story. The new understanding of her death hints at a world in which elites could access painless or controlled exits, while the common people face disorderly ends in war, disease, or execution. It reminds modern observers that technology, whether ancient pharmacology or today's medical interventions, is rarely distributed evenly. Cleopatra's ability to orchestrate her death was a privilege born of rank, education, and access to knowledge. This complicates the romantic image of the brave queen who merely refused capture. Her decision becomes a mirror reflecting the inequalities of her time and, by extension, of ours. When modern readers are drawn to her final act as a symbol of autonomy, they are also encountering the results of a highly specialized intellectual and material infrastructure built to serve the very few. The methodology behind the discovery sends ripples through the study of other historical enigmas. The blend of papyrology, toxicology, and microchemical analysis applied here can be turned on other puzzles that have long hovered at the edge of certainty. Artifacts once dismissed as too degraded may now be reevaluated for chemical ghosts of substances used in rituals, crimes, and intimate personal decisions. Cleopatra's case becomes a proof of concept showing that the dead do not only speak through bones and inscriptions. They speak through the faintest molecular traces clinging to metal and stone, through residues in containers that spent centuries in mud and seawater. The realization that a single droplet of ancient oil left on a bracelet could rewrite such a monumental story instills both excitement and humility in those who study the past. Culturally, this shift in understanding resonates far beyond academic circles. Cleopatra has long served as a screen onto which each era projects its anxieties and fantasies about power, gender, and the exotic. 19th century painters draped her in heavy textiles and jewels to signal dangerous sexuality. Mid-20th century cinema turned her into an emblem of lavish excess. More recent interpretations have tried to recover her as a multilingual ruler and shrewd diplomat. The poison discovery adds another dimension that is harder to commodify yet deeply compelling. Cleopatra, as a figure of scientific literacy, a woman who trusted scholarly networks and technical knowledge at the decisive moment. It encourages storytellers to imagine laboratories as well as bedrooms, scrolls of medical data as well as love letters when they reconstruct her world. The gendered implications are especially striking. For centuries, discussions of Cleopatra have pivoted around her relationships with powerful men, as though her significance derived primarily from the way she influenced or destroyed them. The new narrative breaks that pattern. The critical collaboration in her final hours is not between queen and lover, but between queen and learned specialists whose tools were plants, measurements, and meticulous observation. It is a story about intellectual partnership rather than seduction, about a female ruler leveraging networks of expertise usually associated with male-dominated spaces. Recognizing this does not erase her charisma or her romantic entanglements, but it shifts the center of gravity. Her defining act becomes not a love-inspired impulse, but a calculated, scientifically informed decision about how to exit the stage. There is also a quieter, more existential resonance. Learning that Cleopatra chose a method of dying that minimized pain and visible suffering invites reflection on how humans across time confront the prospect of losing everything. She was not an ordinary woman facing ordinary problems. She stood at the edge of the annihilation of a dynasty and a political order. Yet her choice of a nuanced, gently acting poison shows a familiar human desire to soften the sharp edges of the end, to experience at least a few moments of calm as everything falls away. When seen in this light, the discovery narrows the gap between modern readers and an ancient queen. It reminds us that beneath the regalia and rhetoric, she shared a basic human wish to meet death with some combination of control, clarity, and diminished suffering. The revelation about Cleopatra's carefully orchestrated death invites a slower kind of gaze, one that lingers on the people, objects, and choices that had to converge for such an event to unfold. Behind the queen's final act stood a web of quiet labor, invisible in the grand narratives of conquest and dynasty. There were the physicians who tested combinations of plants in guarded chambers, the scribes who recorded the ratios and observations in precise columns, the attendants who learned how to prepare and store the mixtures without contaminating them. When scientists pieced together the likely method of her death, they were not only recovering a moment in a royal chamber, they were also recovering that entire network of expertise that made the moment possible. Each residue on a jar and each line in a medical papyrus hinted at hands and minds devoted to understanding how the body could be guided gently out of life. Cleopatra's decision to rely on that network suggests a relationship with knowledge that went far beyond the ceremonial. As a ruler educated in multiple languages and steeped in both Greek and Egyptian traditions, she would have been familiar with philosophical arguments about fate, necessity, and the limits of human control. Yet here, she chose a deeply practical application of that abstract thinking. Instead of surrendering to whatever brutal end her enemies might impose, she turned to measured doses, predictable symptoms, and coordinated timing. This alignment between intellectual, worldview, and bodily act is striking. It reveals a queen who did not treat learned disciplines as distant ornaments of the court, but as tools to be used in the most intimate decision a person can make. The physical space in which her final plan took shape takes on a different character when seen through this new understanding. The chambers where she withdrew were not simply hiding places from Roman scrutiny. They become, in imagination, linked to the quiet rooms of temple hospitals and Alexandrian research spaces. Containers of perfume might have sat alongside vessels whose contents no one outside the inner circle was allowed to touch. A dressing table could double as a miniature laboratory surface. Objects once seen purely as luxuries take on a dual identity. Bracelets helping to disguise small amounts of potent substances, cosmetics boxes concealing instruments or powders used to calibrate doses. The sensual richness traditionally associated with Cleopatra's surroundings becomes interwoven with clinical precision. This entwining of aesthetic and scientific elements adds a new layer to the familiar image of her as a mistress of spectacle. Her power over perception was not only grounded in gold and incense, but in an understanding of how bodies react to substances and how those reactions can be shaped to serve a narrative. A death that left her features composed and undistorted would sustain a final impression of calm authority. It would deny her enemies the satisfaction of pointing to a body twisted by agony as proof of the gods' disfavor or her own weakness. When modern scientists propose that such an outcome was achieved through pharmacology rather than chance, they reveal a careful alignment between physiology and image management. Cleopatra was not merely allowing herself to die, she was curating the physical evidence that would remain after her breath stopped. The implications of this are particularly sharp when considering how rulers use their bodies as symbols. A king who dies publicly in battle offers his wounds as proof of courage. A queen who dies in a controlled chamber offers her stillness as proof of composure and inner command. By choosing a method that minimized visible suffering, Cleopatra turned her own body into a final kind of monument. It was not carved in stone or cast in bronze, but it was meant to be seen, remembered, and talked about. When later storytellers replaced the subtle workings of plant-based poisons with the vivid intrusion of a snake, they reimagined that monument in terms that suited their own culture. The scientific reconstruction restores something of Cleopatra's original intention, a carefully shaped last image in which chemistry, ritual, and political calculation intersect. Another dimension of the discovery lies in what it reveals about how secret knowledge was guarded. The formula that likely underpinned her death would not have been common gossip among palace staff. It would have resided in the memory of a few trusted practitioners and in documents kept away from casual eyes. That secrecy would have served both political and practical purposes. In a world where poison was a powerful weapon, knowing how to produce a painless and fairly swift death was a dangerous skill. Restricting it to a narrow circle allowed it to be used only when sanctioned from above, such as in the case of a royal who needed to avoid capture. By recovering traces of this restricted knowledge, modern scientists have opened a window into the ethics and power dynamics of ancient expertise. The palace physician was not simply a healer, He or she was a guardian of thresholds between life and death, operating under the direct trust of the throne. The relationship between Cleopatra and those experts must have been laden with tension and respect. To entrust someone with the task of ending one's life in a specific way is to place extraordinary confidence in their competence and loyalty. The slightest error in dosage could transform a serene departure into a prolonged ordeal. For the physicians, the task would demand a dispassionate focus under emotional strain, balancing their professional attachment to the mechanisms of the body with the personal awareness that they were midwives of a sovereign's final passage. The new understanding of her death invites reflection on these silent participants. It suggests that the event was not the sudden, isolated act implied by the snake story, but the culmination of a quiet collaboration grounded in years of mutual familiarity. The revived story also prompts a fresh look at the intellectual environment that made such collaboration possible. Alexandria was legendary for its scrolls and scholars, but it is easy to imagine its science as cloistered, concerned with abstract mathematics and astronomical tables. The reconstructed poison regimen shows the opposite. Knowledge that had migrated from shelves and lecture halls into the lived realities of court life, embedded in recipes, rituals, and contingency plans. Hypotheses about the effects of certain plant extracts were not left as theoretical claims. They were tested, refined, and codified into instructions that could be enacted under pressure. The same culture that cherished geometry and philosophy also cultivated a granular understanding of how the human heart could be slowed, how breath could be eased, and how consciousness could be led gently toward its end. From a modern perspective, this intertwining of research and rulership raises questions about responsibility. When cutting-edge scientific understanding is placed at the service of a single individual's will, the potential for both humane and troubling outcomes increases. Cleopatra's use of sophisticated poison for her own death could be seen as an example of the humane potential, making a feared event as bearable and dignified as possible. Yet the existence of such knowledge also implies that others might have been removed, at the orders of those in power using similar methods. The same techniques that protect a sovereign from a humiliating fate can be turned toward covert elimination of rivals. The discovery therefore forces a broader reckoning with how advanced expertise in any era tends to cluster where wealth and authority are concentrated. On a symbolic level, the shift from snakebite to calculated poisoning alters the way her death is read as a statement about destiny. The serpent carries connotations of spontaneity and sudden inspiration. It slithers into the room, is seized in a moment of courage or despair, and delivers a single decisive strike. The pharmacological protocol, by contrast, stretches across hours or days. It involves procuring ingredients, preparing them to exact specifications, arranging the environment to ensure privacy and calm. It requires the principal to make her choice, reaffirm it, and then commit to it in stages as the mixture is prepared and administered. This slow choreography transforms the event from a reaction to immediate circumstances into a planned conclusion to a long line of decisions. It reinforces the idea of Cleopatra as someone who did not merely respond to fate, but tried to shape its contours with every instrument available, including her own understanding of bodily processes. This reinterpretation also affects how we read earlier ancient authors who described her end. Their works often oscillate between grudging admiration and moral condemnation, presenting her as both formidable and dangerous. Knowing that their testimonies were already layered over a more complex reality highlights how selective their choices of detail must have been. By focusing on a snake, they channeled the story into pre-existing cultural anxieties about cunning women, exotic practices, and sudden reversals. By ignoring the technical underpinnings of her death, they flattened her relationship with knowledge into something far more one-dimensional. The scientific insight into her method acts like a solvent on those old portrayals, separating out the strands of hostility, fascination, and misunderstanding that shaped them. The implications extend into the realm of how societies remember powerful women. Cleopatra's story has often been used as a cautionary tale about ambition, charm, and the dangers of entangling sex with politics. The new understanding subtly but firmly nudges that framework aside. Here is a woman whose last notable act was not to seduce or plead, but to apply a quiet mastery of bodily science. She did not fade away in a haze of irrational despair. She enacted an informed decision with predictable physiological consequences. That does not erase the romance and intrigue associated with her life, but it insists that any assessment of her must now also take into account her engagement with the technical knowledge of her age. The familiar categories into which she has been placed shrink under this pressure, making room for a more layered and challenging figure. For disciplines that study the ethics of self-chosen death, the revelation adds a potent historical example. Cleopatra's situation was extreme, yet the questions she faced are recognizable. Whether to endure a future imposed by hostile forces, whether to trust that she could retain some measure of dignity if she relinquished control, whether to accept suffering as unavoidable or to seek a different path through learned means. Her solution drew on the best available understanding of how pain and consciousness could be modulated. It was not impulsive and it was not technologically crude. By reconstructing her death in such terms, modern scholars add depth to contemporary debates about autonomy, medical authority, and the role of knowledge in shaping final decisions. The case becomes a reminder that the desire to harness science in service of a controlled exit is not a recent phenomenon, but part of a much older human pattern. There's a quieter, more introspective dimension to the implications as well. Knowing that Cleopatra probably spent her last hours experiencing a controlled sequence of physical changes rather than the instantaneous shock of venom invites speculation about her inner landscape during that time. The pharmacological mixture would have eased pain and anxiety, but not instantly obliterated awareness. There would likely have been a span in which thoughts drifted, memories resurfaced, fears softened at the edges. For a person trained to think politically and symbolically, even those fading moments might have been filled with an awareness of what her choice meant for her line, her city, and her legacy. The modern reconstruction does not grant access to those thoughts, but it suggests that her last experience of consciousness was neither abrupt nor entirely panicked. It was structured, unfolding according to a pattern she had chosen in advance. The new understanding also alters how artists and writers might imagine the scene. The snake, with its suddenness and theatrical menace, naturally lends itself to dramatic staging. A carefully measured draft of liquid or a salve applied to the skin demands a different kind of representation. It shifts attention from shock to intimacy, from a singular explosive moment to a sequence of quiet steps. Painters may begin to depict vials and mixtures in the queen's hands rather than a coiled reptile. Playwrights and novelists might linger on the conversations between Cleopatra and her physicians or attendants as the preparations are made. The story becomes less about a single grand gesture and more about a deliberate ritual, where each small action carries weight. In that sense, the scientific discovery not only informs scholarship, but also expands the imaginative possibilities for retelling the episode. There is an epistemological lesson embedded in this shift. For centuries, scholars analyzed texts, compared versions, argued about whether a snake could realistically have been smuggled into a royal chamber and handled without mishap. The answer always remained somewhat uncertain because it relied on plausibility and conjecture. The introduction of chemical analysis transformed the task. Instead of asking only whether an ancient writer's claim was internally consistent, researchers could ask what substances physically clung to artifacts associated with the event. The past ceased to be accessible only through words and stones. It became available at the level of molecules. This methodological expansion has implications far beyond Cleopatra. It suggests that any long-accepted story, no matter how entrenched, may yet be altered by some overlooked trace awaiting the right technique to become legible. The way the new understanding reshapes Cleopatra's image also hints at the malleability of fame itself. One might imagine that a figure so frequently depicted and discussed had become fixed in the cultural imagination. Yet a handful of scientific papers can tilt the entire picture, shifting her from a femme fatale with a dramatic reptilian prop to a sovereign steeped in medical and philosophical awareness. This demonstrates that historical icons are never completely settled. They are living constructs, continually rebuilt as fresh evidence and methods emerge. Cleopatra's scientifically reconstructed death is a vivid illustration of this ongoing renegotiation. It stands as a reminder that no matter how familiar a story feels, there may still be unseen dimensions waiting to be drawn into the light. Finally, the revelation compels a reconsideration of what it means to exercise power at the very edge of powerlessness. When all external options had been stripped away, Cleopatra still found a narrow corridor of action. Within that corridor, she used the tools of knowledge, trust, and preparation to craft a departure that aligned with her values and strategic sense. The controlled, pharmacologically guided death, uncovered by modern researchers, is not an isolated curiosity. It is the culmination of a lifetime spent navigating between vulnerability and authority. It encapsulates the paradox of her position, a woman subject to overwhelming forces, yet determined to assert agency in the only sphere that remained entirely her own, the timing and form of her own end. The scientific unraveling of her method allows that paradox to be seen with unprecedented clarity, deepening the significance of an event that had long been obscured beneath the coils of a legendary snake. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Cleopatra's true death cause finally revealed? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.